All right, I'm going to call this to order. If some folks could carry these conversations out into the hallway, please, that would be much appreciated. My goodness. All right, well, thank you, everyone. We're settling in here now, so I'm going to call this to order. This is the Coastal Pelagics Management Board. We're going to start with approval of the agenda. Are there any additions or modifications to the agenda? Okay, seeing none, agenda is approved by consent. We'll look at approval of the proceedings from May of 2022. Are there any edits to the proceedings? Seeing none, again, we'll consider that approved by consent. I don't see many members of the public here, but I will open this up for any public comment on items not on the agenda, and we'll also look at hands for anyone online. Okay, I think we can move through that. We don't see any hands. Okay. We're going to move into the 2022 Spanish mackerel stock assessment and peer review. Those of you who have looked through the material and have been paying attention to the South Atlantic Council would probably agree there's no other way to describe this as quite a kerfuffle. So we're very fortunate to have our good friend John Carmichael here, who's the executive director of the South Atlantic Council. John's going to do his best to give us a background on the assessment itself, the concerns from the SSC for the council, and just possibilities on what our next steps are. So I'm going to turn it over to John, and once again thank him for doing this for us.
All right, thank you, Joe. It's been a long time since I gave a stock assessment presentation around this table, so it's kind of fun actually. Looking forward to it. All right, next slide. So the stock was recently assessed through CDAR 78. I'm going to go through a few highlights from that stock assessment. Slides you'll see are from the SSC presentation, our SSC presentation in August. There's a couple of them have PDF references which refer to the CDAR 78 assessment report. All of this information available on the South Atlantic Council website at the SSC meeting, as well as through the CDAR website under CDAR 78. You can find all the iterations of the stock assessment report. So next slide. A little bit of background on the stock and its assessment history. It was previously assessed in CDAR 28 back in 2012. So here we are in 2022. It's been quite a while since the stock was assessed. Part of that was due to delays from the MRIP telephone survey to effort survey transition, where this was held off a bit to get the effort survey data, and then COVID came along. So there was plans to get this thing done several years ago, but as it turned out, it wasn't able to get completed until last year. So back in CDAR 28, the stock was not overfished and it was not overfishing. And then in CDAR 78 recently updated the data to 2020. So that's probably the first thing to note. 2020 was the COVID year, and we all know that there were some quirks of data collection during 2020, and certainly some unexpected things happened as far as recreational effort in particular. As turns out, people really lacked for time. They did this through the operational process, which means it's somewhat streamlined. There's not lots of meetings. There's not a full data workshop. They get together, talk about some issues, go over the data, do most of the work through webinars. There was one data scoping call, and through the process, 4 different assessment webinars where the model was discussed. And there's a panel that's created, and they give input and approval of all the decisions. And all of that played out during the year. And next slide. The main things that were changed going from 28 to CDAR 78 dealt with the data and the model updates. Normally, when we do an operational, we bring the model framework up to whatever the current state of the art is. Sometimes there's programming changes, et cetera, that take place over the years. So you can imagine adding 8 years of data, there were a number of different things added within the model, different ways of approaching uncertainty and solving and configurations, etc. But the main input changes dealt with the growth model. 28 was a sex-specific growth model, and that's now been abandoned. Just issues with the data, dividing things out by sex when you're already kind of struggling to get the data together, as well as perhaps less suggestion that the growth is really that different. Natural mortality was updated to the current state of the art for estimating natural mortality and different natural mortality across ages. And there were some revised growth parameters because the growth model is being updated. Input data updated through 2020. Most significant change there being going from the Coastal Household Telephone Survey of MRIP to the FES of MRIP. And it was a shortened time series. The previous model went back into the 50s. This one started in 1986. Prior to 1986, there was some years of significantly higher commercial landings than really what you see now. And there's not a lot of data necessarily to support those to understand, say, the agent length comp. So that was one of the issues in 28. If the modelers thought perhaps shortening the time series, getting the landings more in line with when you have surveys and length and age comps may make the model perform a little bit better, maybe give it a better chance at estimating stock productivity. But one of the things that did do was cut out some indication of potentially periods of much higher stock productivity. And then finally, there was some alternative pooling of commercial age comps due to low sample sizes. This was a big topic of discussion, particularly the samples from the northern area, as we're seeing more and more fish being caught farther to the north. And I think it underscores some of the challenges we're going to face as we deal with stocks like this, which cross over what is continuing to be a critical boundary within the NIMS, at least the federal scientific program between the Northeast Center and the Southeast Center, with that break between Virginia and North Carolina and different data collection programs, different ways of getting the sampling done and how they approach, commercial port sampling and other sampling. So, there was a thought from some of the fishermen that perhaps there may be more age comps in some of those northern areas than may have been dug up for this assessment. So that was a lot of discussion about the commercial age comps and their difficulty in actually fitting to what was observed. The next slide. And then there's the recreational data issues. So one of the things first noted was there's a spike in the 2020 data, the terminal year, and not surprising to those who've been following the MRIP transition for many years, that ended up being primarily in shore mode and in Florida. So you have a fishery that's crunching along. I'll show in the figure in a little minute, a pretty steady landings. Then 2020 comes and the wreck just starts going through the roof. That was evaluated. There was a working paper, number 3, developed for it that goes into the detail, burrowing down into the MRIP estimates to see where the high catches are showing up. But ultimately, it sort of comes out, well, this is the estimate, and the estimate gets put into the model, and you see how it plays out. So while it was evaluated, there wasn't anything like changing the estimate or using an average or anything like that. So next slide. So now we'll get into some of the actual information. So this one is primarily recreational and shrimp bycatch. So it just shows you what the discard trends are. There's not a lot of shrimp bycatch, but you can see the recreational data, the general rec in the blue, and then the general rec landings in the gray. So the general rec discard is the blue, the landings is the gray. And as you see, as you look over to the right, there's pretty much a flat trend in the landings and then a big spike at the end in the last few years. And then in the discards, you just see kind of a regular increasing trend, although those also do spike to really series highs there in 2020 and even somewhat in 2019 in this figure. So 2019 may have looked like, kind of like normal, but when 2020 came along, as you can see with those rightmost points, it really took those landings to somewhere that hadn't been seen before. So next slide. And then this is the trend in the commercial landing. So the orange line shows where the current 1986 start year. If you look back in the past, you see to the left of that line, that's what was used in CDAR 28. And you see those high landings. Those are just slightly to the left. That's in the late 70s, 80s, when the commercial fishery really had some high landings. And the anecdotal information from fishermen that were fishing at that time has said, yeah, they believe that that happened, the fishery exploded, and they really recognized that that was too high of landings and, supported the reduction in harvest that followed. But what you see going from the 1986 model to the current time is you see high landings, somewhat high landings continuing, and then they drop down quite a bit. And generally, there's not a lot of trend in those landings from after about 2000. It's fairly flat. So next slide. The indices, there's not a lot of indices for this stock. We have a hook and line indice from the Florida Trip Ticket Program. We have an MRIP recreational CPUE with all of the caveats and uncertainties and concerns that go with any MRIP CPUE. And then we have a CMAP trawl that gets at the young of the year. And CMAP, is in the south, so if there's any larvae appearing farther north, we're probably not getting them. And importantly is there was no young of year value in 2020 from CMAP due to COVID. So the CMAP is the gray line, and you can see that that's sort of trending downward on the rightmost. And then there's a gap in 2020. We don't know where it went. But also you notice that both the blue and the orange, which is the hook and line and the MRIP, both of those dropped from 2019 to 2020. So you think about the terminal year, that's going to be important to what the model is thinking is going on with the stock, because it's going into a period where these indices are saying, oh, the stock kind of dropped down in 2020, and some of these indices are, mid-year. And it's also being told from the landings that there was a lot of catch in 2020. So that's a recipe for the model to think the stock biomass is going down. So next slide. And so the SSC reviewed all of this information at their meeting earlier in the year, and some of the issues and challenges that they highlighted were the difficulty in selecting that initial start year. So that change in 1986 didn't come easy. The model didn't seem to really have a strong preference. It didn't give a lot of indication as to what start year was best start year, and it really wasn't very well behaved on that parameter. The limited age composition information, as I mentioned, while natural mortality was changed its approach, there still was a lot of difficulty in getting a good, robust estimate of it. The surveys, as I just showed, they're pretty flat. They lack a lot of contrast, which is really important to knowing how the stock is responding. And they kind of conflict with landings trends. So we have that decline in the surveys in the terminal years. We have landings going way up. So there's a lot of pieces of information that aren't really coming together well in this model. And then, of course, which is often the case for our stocks, they were unable to estimate steepness, which is the critical stock recruitment parameter, which gives you an idea of how strong that relationship is. So steepness was fixed in suggesting there's not a very strong stock recruitment relationship for the stock. That also makes it difficult when you're trying to estimate future, because putting the recruits into the population is critical for your future projections. And when you don't really have steepness, it's hard to know how your stock's going to respond to different levels of SSB in the future. So this is what the SSC was faced with. Next slide. But they did look at the stock status again, so they had all those challenges looking at the results. You see this model. So stock status, as far as is the stock overfished, is the stock overfishing, you look at that and say, oh, okay, it's pretty good, right? I mean, I'm not overfished and I'm not overfishing. That tends to make most people think that, oh, great, the assessment's doing fine. This is based on the average of the last 3 years of that assessment, 2018 through 2020. So it's not capturing, it's not like it's just 2020. It's those last 3 years. And it's a pretty good spread, and it looks pretty decent, but there's always more to the assessment than this. So next slide. If we now look into what we're actually seeing as far as the trends in SSB and fishing mortality here, so the orange lines are the biomass. So the squiggly one with the dots is the actual SSB estimates. The red line with it, that's the SSB MSY. So that's the target level. The orange line that it's above over its entire time series, that's the minimum stock size threshold. That's the level you want to stay above, or else your stock is declared overfished. And then the blue below it, the one with the circles, is the actual F estimates. The lighter blue line running through there, that's your FMSY. You want to be below the FMSY. So the history of this stock is that biomass has trended since 1985 to 2020, kind of up and down around the MSY levels, and actually in a lot of years quite a bit higher. Never been down to MSST. F has been at or below FMSY the whole time series until noticed right there on the far right, 2020, the model wants to drive the F up above FMSY slightly. So technically you would say the stock was overfishing in 2020, but because of uncertainty in the terminal year, the status, the convention in the South Atlantic is using the average of the last 3 years. The official status comes out even from this assessment that overfishing is not occurring. And while the stock is dropped down, it's close to the MSY levels, it's still quite a bit above the minimum stock size threshold. So it doesn't appear to be, bumping up against certainly overfished yet, at least in these runs. So the important thing here is that, you see how this stock has performed pretty well, pretty flat for a lot of years. And the fishermen we heard from the SSC presentations and council discussion agreed that that's what they think has really been happening. They said this stock has been amazingly consistent for the last 20, 30 years. So next slide. Things begin to look a little bit different, as I suggested, when you start to look at the projections. So here we're looking at the landings and the SSB. So the SSB is the orange, the blue is the landings, and at the red you have the terminal, the vertical red line, that's the terminal year, so that's 2020. Those values to the right of that are what's projected in the stock assessment projection models. So this is where you really start to see the impact of what the assessment is telling you as far as of interest to management versus what it may be saying about stock status. Stock status is the past. It influences management, but it's really not a driving factor for managers. What really matters to us as managers is what can we catch in the future when we put a management plan in place. So the first thing to notice is looking at landings in the blue over on the right, the darker blue. You see the landings are pretty high in the first couple of years of the projections. That's again because of using the idea of the average landings continuing. So if you feed the model the average landings, and we saw an increase in 2019 and a big increase in 2020, you're telling the model during that what we call the interim period before you apply a different F, you're telling the model that landings are going to be pretty high. So what the model is doing is it's taking that orange line, which is the stock biomass, and remember, so from 2019 to 2020, we see that orange line dip down, and then because of those higher landings and with the model not having anything to tell it there's a lot of fish up there to support those higher landings, you see the biomass level drop considerably. So that in 2021, the biomass level is down at the MSST level. In 2022, the biomass level is below MSST. In 2023, the biomass is quite a bit below MSST. It's actually projected to be at the lowest biomass the stock has ever seen during this whole 1986 onward period. So that's quite a bit concerned because the model is taking the stock into a place that none of the history has ever shown it to be at. And so this is where I think some of the quirks in that data, the spike that you see in the recreational data, the lack of a juvenile survey, going into a projection period with a trajectory in that stock during your terminal year, really all comes together into what created kind of the management storm. So, if these results carry through, and it's really hard to say just yet, but if projections like this were to carry through, we're going to the fishermen and saying you have this stock which has been crunching along great for 30 years, but your landing is going to be cut in half. And bear in mind, for a number of years we've been looking forward to this assessment to potentially give us some increased yield, anticipating that the fishery effort survey will show higher effort and higher landings over time, show the stock was maybe a little bit bigger, more productive, and that would help us deal with some of these closures we've been experiencing in the northern zone. And I think most of you guys probably know that the commercial fishery in the northern zone has been getting shorter and shorter every year. This year was the shortest it's been. 2020 was the shortest, 21 the shortest before that, and 2020 the shortest before that. So it's kind of hard to rectify from observed data perspective of something like the commercial fishery in the northern zone that the stock is at an all-time low, because there's just no way the stock can be at an all-time low and that fishery be having the shortest season it's ever had. So the projections really just don't line up with what we've heard from the fishermen. We heard it loud and clear at the SSC meeting and the council meeting, and what we're seeing in the actual data that we have to look at this population. So This is the real problem with the assessment. In my mind, and I told NIFS, if y'all don't want to come talk about it, I will, and I'll give my opinion. I think that the model does a pretty good job of capturing the history of this stock when it has full data on the cohorts. When it's got a fully fished out cohort and it's got a couple years of fishery information, it can do a pretty good job of estimating. But when we project into the future, I just don't have any confidence myself that this model has good projection abilities. It's not very predictive, and that happens sometimes in modeling. It's one thing to observe and describe what happened, but it's another thing to use that to infer the future. And to me, that's the real core problem we're facing with this model. So next slide. So the SSC recommendations coming out of this, where they were concerned with those data and fit issues I mentioned, they did not make a BSIA, Best Scientific Information Evaluation or recommendation. They did not provide a revised ABC, and they suggested that a working group be created to provide guidance on some next assessment steps to see if they can fix the model, if they can get to something that they feel is robust and they have confidence in. So next slide. Those recommendations came to the council at the September 2022 meeting. The assessment was presented. The SSC recommendations were presented. Those issues were highlighted. At that meeting, the Science Center offered to update the CDR 78 results with some revised MRIP estimates. So we had Richard Cody on the phone at the meeting and talked about some things they could look at to try and revise those MRIP landings that we highlighted, those high observations in 2020, 2021, et cetera. And the plan was that could be done and reviewed by the SSC when it met a few weeks ago at its October meeting. So next slide. So they were able to get that work done. So the SSC met October 25th through 27th. They did review this. This was it's another presentation on our website here. This is the cover slide that went in detail of those changes. They had a revised model and we had updated MRIP values included in it. Next slide. And here's a few highlights of the MRIP revisions. If you look at the figures on your right, you were seeing the general recreational landings and the general recreational discards. And those are showing the base model and the model with the new MRIP. And probably the first thing you're looking at is you're saying line on there. But no, there are two lines on there. It's just that the model really didn't respond at all to the revisions in the MRIP data. And so the changes were primarily 2020, 2021 landings, East Florida, shore mode, state waters, and inland. The same components of MRIP that have been discussed through the transition many times with many species, and particularly in Florida. And some of the changes, for example, just those highlighted bullets in 2025, East Florida shore, the state waters went from 2,327 to 223,812 fish. So that caught the SSC's eye. They were like, well, that's a really big change. How do you change the landings that much and you didn't change the model? The inland went from 1 million to 400,000. So one went up 200,000, one went down 800,000. Net change landings went down 600,000, but it didn't really seem to affect the model. You'll also see in 2021, so the previous model didn't have any data for 2021, but now we do have some data for 2021. And we see the territorial seas going from 2.5 million to 1.2 million. So they dropped down by 1.3 million fish. And the inland went from 82,000 to 175,000, so up 100,000. So first thing you see there is in 2021, we saw an awful lot of Spanish mackerel available to the recreational fishery, which I think kind of reinforces the idea that there's no way the stock can be as low as the model seems to want to take it in the projections if a shore-based recreational and inshore recreational are able to find that many Spanish mackerel. There must be a lot of Spanish mackerel out there. So the SSC, in looking at these, looking at the technical aspects of it, concerned with the magnitude of those changes, those are some pretty significant changes, and they really didn't feel like they had a very good explanation for why just looking into the estimates and doing some imputing and some other changes could result in such a huge change in the MRIP estimate. So rather than, I think, giving them more confidence, it probably gave them less confidence in the model and certainly in the recreational input data as far as how well it's representing what's really going on out there in the fishery. So next slide. Based on the review of the model there, and particularly those issues with direct data and the lack of the model response to such changes, They did not feel the MRIP estimates resolved their concerns. They again did not evaluate BSIA, nor did they recommend a new ABC. And the working group just sat there on hold from August to from September to October after the Science Center said they would do some new runs. But when those new runs didn't really give anybody any more warmer and more fuzzy feelings, the working group's now been dusted off, and they're going to develop some terms of reference for additional assessment analyses. The SSC is planning to meet in January via webinar to review an assessment. I forget which stock, but they're going to look at these terms of reference, provide them to the Science Center analysts. Hopefully they will do the runs, and we're anticipating additional Spanish model runs coming for the April 2023 SSC meeting. So we're pushing this out a little bit further, and Council, we are now extending our timeline as far as getting started on an actual amendment. And the SSC is still, the assessment really is still kind of in limbo in terms of the SSC's mind. So next slide. Where does this leave management? So we have ABCs in place. We have existing ABCs, and they're still in effect, and they're in effect until the SSC gives us another ABC, always the case. There is some guidance from NIMS on what to do if, say, an assessment is rejected in terms of ABC, but we're not at that point yet. The assessment hasn't been rejected. As I said, it's still kind of in limbo, and the SSC is still hoping to get something out of it and get something more robust. So we're not at the point of, say, applying the NIMS guidance to say, what do we do now in the interim? But there has been a lot of talk about whether or not these changes can fix CDAR 78, or whether we need to go back to the drawing board and maybe do a full benchmark of Spanish, which would be several years, probably 5 years, best case 10 years, most realistic case in the future. So the ABC we have is in place. The ACL is in place. The amendment, actually initiating amendment, is on hold until we deal with the assessment and get an ABC. But the council does intend to begin talking about the allocations within Spanish mackerel in December at our upcoming meeting, and applying an allocation decision tool, which council has developed over a couple of years, way of getting information from a variety of sources and processing it into a way that council can digest it and use it for allocation decision making. So we're going to have some discussions of Spanish. We just won't be at the point of, say, dealing with new catch levels, etc. And next slide. So what does that mean to us for the stock as we continue to work through this process? The stock risk appears low, based certainly on the history and the anecdotal information we've heard from the fishermen and from our advisors as far as what they're seeing out there on the water. There's high availability, proven in the data. MRIP landings are high, discards remained high. Commercial sectors reporting large fish, which you go back into that time when the commercial landings were really high, back there in the late 70s, they did not see large fish, and that's one of the things that they've noted. When they say they were overfishing that stock, and they truly believe it, and they did not see the big fish, and now they're saying they see the big fish. And I think also very important is that steadily shortening northern zone seasons, through 2022, which just indicates high availability of the stock to those fisheries. The only suggestion of the stock risk arises just in the projections. And they're uninformed by data. They don't have age comps, they don't have CPUE, they don't have surveys to carry into there and tell what's going on with the stock. So it really just becomes kind of an accounting exercise of how many fish are out there. You apply the F, and this is how many can come out. But you don't have any of that other information that I think this model really, really needs. I think it needs the age comp. I think it needs the surveys to really get a handle of what the population's doing. Now, one risk and one challenge is certainly that management now remains based on the Coastal Household Telephone Survey, the old way of doing MRIP, and not the newer FES. And every year we go that we have to convert FES to CHTS. We know that adds to the uncertainty, and it certainly adds to a bit of frustration with constituents, because if you go to the MRIP website, you're going to get FES estimates. And this creates confusion all the time, because folks will go there and they'll see a different estimate reported for Spanish mackerel than what, say, the Southeast Regional Office is reporting on their quota tracking page, their ACL monitoring page, because they are converting back to the CHTS numbers. So that's just a hassle that we have to deal with. It creates confusion, and it probably adds uncertainty to the whole process. So the sooner we can get this the catch levels updated to the current method of doing MRIP, the better, because it just relieves a lot of that confusion. And then, of course, important here is those actions to address the northern zone closures are on hold until we can deal with these issues. And then the last thing is just, what's the question of climate change for this stock? If this stock is shifting north, how long is it going to take for our assessment data system to recognize that, is the productivity higher because the stock is spreading over a larger area? Is its carrying capacity going up? Is it shifting? We still see fish in the south, so there's not a lot of thought that Spanish is significantly just shifting northward, but it does seem to be some indication of, increasing landings northward. There's not a lot in the data yet to really feel like you can hang your hat on it, but certainly anecdotally in what we're hearing, it does seem to be ramping up a bit, certainly farther north than it has been historically. So next slide. I think we're getting to the end. Yep, that was the last one. So I guess I'll see if there's any questions on that, Emily.
Yeah, thanks, John. It really is great to have you back presenting stock assessments here with us. I am going to open it up to questions for John on the assessment and all that information presented. So, Emily and I have thought about what's next for the board, and obviously I need opinions on that from all of you. So as you're asking questions, keep in mind we need to figure out our comfort level with exactly what John has said. Do we agree that there's low risk for this stock? Do we have concerns about the timeline? Regarding the northern commercial closures, I think, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we can kind of cover that in the next agenda item a little too. So not worried so much about that. We can have that discussion later, but questions about the assessment, about where the SSC is, about the timelines, and then just overall communication between the board and the council as we go through this. So I'll open it up to questions now. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to echo Joe's sentiments. It's great to have you up here. Dr. Carmichael, you always give an amazing presentation, break it down really well. So thank you so much for being here. I do have a couple questions, so stop me if I'm running on too long. My first question is just a general question. Why did the subcommittee choose to do an operational assessment when it had been so long since the last assessment?
Yeah, so that's partially due to process, partially due to workload management. Our other option is to do what's a research track, which they would go in and look at all the information. It takes about 2 years. It would have an independent peer review, including the CIE. So because they were using the same model and just updating the data, felt like the operational approach would give enough of a process to get where they needed to go. I think people were maybe a little surprised by just how the model has performed and the difficulty in resolving the natural mortality in the start year and a number of things from that prior CDR 28 assessment. The SSC has had a lot of discussion about recommending, just stop here and do a benchmark or, research track as we call it. But they realize, those are planned several years out and that could add significant delay. So I think they're feeling a bit of that dilemma.
Follow up. So maybe this is a little bit of guessing, but how are we feeling about the update coming up in April? Do we think that we're going to get there? I don't know if there's been any consideration or discussions just yet of what might change in order to kind of get us to a different place than where we're ending up right now. Just kind of trying to think into the future.
Yeah, and I talked to the analysts about that quite a bit. They do feel like high optimism that they can get it done. It may somewhat depend on exactly what the SSC requests, but they can get a fair amount of things done, they feel like, between January and the April meeting. Whether or not it resolves the issues is a question. I think everyone was perhaps surprised that big changes in the MRIP data didn't really give the model much response. think that's, coming at the terminal year, things are pretty well locked into place by the long history. So I think there's more questions as to whether or not minor changes like that or other configuration changes can actually significantly move the needle on this model, because it seems, very well locked in where it is. The issues in the picking the start year suggest that it's kind of wagging over on that side. But once you feed it, a lot of 20, 30 years of data for a short-lived fish, a lot of cohorts have moved through in that time, and those are pretty well locked into that history. I think you get that stock stability. But what it's going to do on the end we're concerned about here and the projections is kind of anyone's guess. And I sense some SSC members and others maybe feeling like, yeah, not so sure this is going to change a lot. Others with a little higher optimism and kind of feeling like, they need to go through this and do everything they can to try and salvage this model if possible, if only just in the interest of time, knowing that if they were to just reject it, that it will be several years before another effort can be made.
One more, if you don't mind. Last one, I promise. So you have up on the screen discussions about how the projections are really uninformed by some of those data. There's no age comps, the CPUE, the surveys are, flat. What would we be looking at? How would a research track or a benchmark be able to potentially better inform those projections? Or do you think it's just a matter of really tearing apart the model and kind of starting over entirely? Are we data limited? Like, are we unable to incorporate those things into the projections with the data that we currently have? Just kind of thinking out and wondering what's going to change between now and potentially a research track that we're going to be able to better inform those projections.
I think one of the challenges is just this model ending in 2020 with COVID. When COVID started, there was a lot of concern and people weren't going to fish and licenses weren't going to be sold, and what was going to happen. And we saw quite the opposite. People went fishing a lot. We see a lot of stocks with increased landings. We see, a lot of shore and inshore effort that happened at that time. So I think that's just kind of an unfortunate quirk of the timing of this model. But when, back in 2020, talking about things, there was a lot of concern about models and assessment models that would be done with like a 2020 terminal year. What is that data? If things are really different than the past, which is what models kind of rely on, what is that really going to do? And the loss of surveys was a concern. So we didn't get the juvenile survey. So I don't think that doing what we have now as a research track would have changed a whole lot unless, maybe it found some more data or some different ways of dealing with like the age data from more northern areas, which some of the fishermen have identified, basically saying, look, I've been sampled, the data are somewhere, that sort of thing. So I don't think that would have done much with a 2020 terminal year. I think if we were to do it and update that to 2021 or 2022, we may get over that COVID hump. We could feed it some more juvenile survey information, the survey from the fishery information. There was some talk about looking at the commercial Florida trip ticket in more detail and trying to make sure that's as strong as it can be. So I think those things would be likely to create some changes, but it still may struggle to project. And, to me, that's one of the things that's just inherent in a stock assessment model. You just don't know what the fishery characteristics are going to be 3 years into the future. And, I just truly believe we all need to spend more time and be more critical of looking at those projections and thinking, do they really capture what's going on? Because I notice in assessments, and it happened big time in this one, there's a tendency to look at status, and if it's not overfished and not overfishing, everybody thinks it's great. And that happened here. So this model came out, results were out, and people are like, oh yeah, Spanish looks great. It's not overfished, it's not overfishing. And I'm like, well, did you look at what you can catch in 2023? And they're like, what? I'm like, half what you're catching now. People are like, what? Wait a minute. So I think that that's just something we have to deal with in projections, and research track won't help that. unless somebody comes up with a better crystal ball or some other way that's more robust, you know. But we all know, like, we're talking about the climate change issues, and that could be affecting a stock like this. A short-lived, fast-growing stock is probably likely to respond quickly to environmental changes, and I think it could be an ongoing challenge for us in the future with this stock in particular.
Thanks, John. Chris, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation, John. I think you laid out the challenges and risks pretty well. I think you mentioned in 2021 the recreational harvest was also high. Was that also attributed to the shore mode in Florida, or is that from other high rec landings?
It was shore mode, and it was shore mode in multiple states, as I recall, in general. But Florida is the one that's particularly stood out through this whole time with their shore mode landings in the transition to FES. But it was high. 2022, I looked at that last week, and we don't have the full information in, but through the waves that were done, 2022 looked down a little bit more like historic normal. But this, with the uncertainty there, all it takes is one really good wave and some high effort, and it could be right back up to where 2020 and 2021 were.
Follow up. Go ahead, Chris.
Eric, follow up and one other question. So yeah, I noticed that the shore mode harvest the last couple of years was much higher than the private mode and private boat mode, and then years past it was more on par with private boat. I didn't know if using the old MREP estimates from the last assessment showed kind of a similar breakdown between the shore mode and the private boat mode, because one result of the revised MREP estimates is it combined the beach bank mode with the pier mode, and in doing that, of course, what you catch off the end of a 1,000-foot pier is a lot different than what you catch from shore. So I don't know if that might be having an influence on the catch estimates for Spanish mackerel when you consider just the sheer number of trips from shore and the catch rates from piers is factoring into that. So I guess there's a question in there somewhere. So didn't know if that kind of played a role possibly.
Yeah, you do. In the old MREP and in the older years, even in CHTS, the boat mode always was the higher proportion of recreational landings than shore. But it's in those last few years now that data's just being collected through FES, and you do see that the shore mode is running away, far exceeding the boat mode, which that's where I think some of the survey changes and stuff may be of question. I know, like, the Outer Banks had a pretty darn good year for Spanish this year, off the piers and off the beach. So yeah, you get that effort cranked up with some pretty good catches, and you're liable to see it spike up again. So yeah, it does seem to me, at least, that it is something with CHTS, and it may be, as you say, lumping the piers and the shore together could be having an impact.
Thanks. And just one final question on the the allocation decision that the South Atlantic Council is going to think about in December. How is that going to work where you have catch estimates or catches from the commercial and recreational fishery now based on revised MREP, but we're still dealing with a catch in the old currency. So I'm just curious to know just what kind of work that the South Atlantic Council can do on allocations now, with just that disconnect between catch and the currency, and then also the uncertainty in the recreational harvest estimate, especially when you're looking at commercial recreational allocations.
Yeah, the intent on that was that we would have the ABC and we would have the recreational now in the CHTS, and we could apply the allocations. If we want to look at historical years, we'll have that with the CHTS conversion. I mean, the FES conversion. I always flip-flop those. We'd have the new MREP and we'd be able to apply that. So I think likely what the council will do to look at the FES and MREP updates and apply that for the allocations. But, you know, the intent is that whatever allocation percentage changes might happen, they'd be applied in the amendment that brings in the new ABC. So at least at this point, there's no plans to try and revise allocations based on new data and apply them to an ABC based on old data. But we're thinking allocation could be, you know, a tough discussion. So it might be worth our time to go ahead and start talking about that anyway.
Other questions? Go ahead, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks, John. Great presentation. So just thinking a little bit about, it just seems like there's not enough information available. You know, just the discussion we've been having it, I don't know what would change, you know, to kind of give more information to this statistical model. It's a great group working on it. Like, I think they would have figured it out, you know, if there was something there. So I just wondered, I kind of poked around a little bit. So yeah, you know, you made the comment about the research track, how like it's mapped out, like, you know, pretty far out into the future. But there is a state space approach research track going on now. And I wonder, did they think about that? Did they think about putting this in as one of the candidate? I think the way they did this was they kind of picked a set of candidate species that they were going to kind of bring into that research track. So I wondered if, you know, this, I think it's either about to start or maybe just started. I'm not sure where it's at. It's coming up soon. So was wondering, you know, if that was a thought, maybe there's a way to kind of shoehorn it in sort of late in the game, but that might be a way to sort of get something in a quicker time frame using a different tool. So my whole point is I think you need a new tool. That might be one, it might not, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a good idea, actually. I'm not, top of my head, not sure what the stocks are, but Spanish seems to have come out of left field as a surprise. So it might be one that is worth seeing if we can get it in there, especially if there are some distribution shifts going on. That may help.
Thanks, Jeff. Any other questions? Go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, maybe this sort of segues into the next agenda item, but John, as far as timing goes, you know, the new work will be done for the April SSC. April SSC does their work, and I assume they're going to report out at the June council meeting. So at the June council meeting, the council will see the new information, and they go one of two ways, right? They decide, hey, this is good enough, we can base management on this, let's go forward, or they say this is not good enough, and then we're stuck, right? Unless, you know, Jason's idea works out, or, you know, we're going to have this interim period where we really don't have much management advice, and the stock's moving, and, you know, so I think that's going to be our big problem area. If it doesn't work, we may have 5 years where we really don't have management guidance, and we're trying to manage the stock, and the public expects some good news, but we don't have any good news. So is that kind of the dilemma we're potentially in? Is this big chunk of time where we don't have any assessment guidance? We need to keep this thing going.
Yeah, I think that kind of is how it would play out if the council gets it in June. I would think if these new runs and iterations of the model don't resolve the issues to the SSC satisfaction, then I think we would push them to say, well, you know, are you at the point of rejecting this model? We can't, you know, come back in October with some more runs. Like, we're going to have to do something a bit more serious and robust to resolve the issues. I feel if they can't settle it, they can't give us a new ABC in April based on this model, then I think we do need to invoke, okay, the model is essentially not informative for ABC. Let's look at our other options and the different data limited approaches. What you do when an assessment is essentially rejected. What do you do in the interim? Because there is guidance there. There's stuff in the national standards. I think we would really have to put that on the table for the SSC and encourage them to say, okay, give us an ABC with the best information you have now. Otherwise, as you say, we're waiting a number of years, and I just don't think that we can hold this existing ABC for another 5, 6, 7 years. I think that would be a really bad idea.
Great. And yeah, we're kind of coming to time on this issue. But as I mentioned, Emily, has given this a lot of thought on where does the board go next. One thing that she's noted that I want to put out there for all of you too is that we don't have a technical committee for this, for Spanish mackerel. So, just thoughts from the board on if it's time for that, or are we in a wait and see? I'm not sure that we would have any tasks for them at this point, but it is one thing to think about. So I am interested in, again, comfort levels and thoughts on what are the board's next steps, other than are we comfortable with just waiting to see if we get a new ABC next year? Go ahead, Spud.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a frustrating situation for us and for the council to be in this position of sort of limbo. But I think absent any definitive information on which to move forward, we don't have any choice but a wait and see posture, at least for the short term. I'm interested to learn a little more about as these fisheries are moving northward, where are they actually being prosecuted at? Because one of the things that I heard at our South Atlantic Council mackerel cobia AP is that, with the exception of off of Cape Canaveral, Florida, the commercial fisheries are being prosecuted in state waters, which prompted one of our commercial fisheries representatives to say, is this a species that should be considered for management under the commission rather than the council? And, I tried to artfully deflect that as best I could, but it does raise an interesting question of, and especially in what we're going to be talking about this afternoon, of, what are the optimal governance structures for managing changing fisheries? And, I had to kind of explain, well, we depend on CDR like the council depends on CDR. It's not like we have our own separate stock status determination that gives us a different answer than the council would operate on. But, is the fishery, as it moves northward, is it occurring primarily in state waters, or is it a mixture of state and federal waters? And if so, if it's primarily state waters, then, do we owe ourselves at least the analysis that we did for cobia, looking forward into what is the best governance structure in the future? So I think that's something we can be doing now to sort of think about, is where are those fisheries occurring? Where are they likely to occur? And sort of have that available in our minds as we move forward with whatever steps we take, assuming that we get something other than what we have. And as John politely, I think, communicated, there's a lot of skepticism that we're going to get anything different than what we have. So anyway, that's my perspective. Thank you.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that, and I agree, and that kind of goes back into this next agenda item that we have, looking at the regs and the differences that the states have compared to the federal FMP. But that does kind of sound like a TC task, I think. So that is, but that is a consideration. I think Emily and I can start working on that information. But if that's the kind of thing we're going to be looking at, then we might want to give real consideration to populating a technical committee for help with that. And we have Erica. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Joe. John, thank you for your presentation. And I appreciate the hours we've been able to discuss the stock assessment and its challenges. This commercial fishery is very important to Florida. It really is a Florida fishery, but the jurisdiction complications for managing Spanish mackerel are challenging. So I would not want to get in front of the council at this time, Joe. My preference would be to wait and see what comes out of March. not only do we have an ASMFC plan and a South Atlantic Fishery Management Council plan, Spanish mackerel is part of a joint FMP at the federal level with the Gulf Council. So there's lots of pieces to unravel as we talk about the future of this fishery and how we manage it moving forward. But in the meantime, I would like to learn more about the growing fish region to the north. Who are the participants? Where are the landings happening? I think we could use the interim time to really dig in and understand this fishery better, and perhaps bringing in our advisory panel to give us sort of a profile of the fishery. In Florida, it's complicated again. We have 3 different types of commercial fishery prosecuting Spanish mackerel, and I don't know how complicated it is up to the north, but I'd like to learn more. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So I think we're getting a sentiment here, and I certainly agree with all that's been said. And like I said, Emily and I will look into that, and we'll you know, the commission will look to see when's the appropriate time for this board to reconvene, and if we have to do some stuff by email in the interim, I'm sure we can do that. So if there isn't any other hands on this item, we'll move into those differences in the state and federal management, and I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So moving into this presentation, I'll just give a brief overview of the differences between the state and federal FMPs. Again, as we've just discussed, this will probably come up again next year whenever the board reconvenes for the next time. We just wanted to remind folks about these differences that the board discussed almost 2 years ago now in 2020. So next slide. So the last update to the interstate FMP for Spanish mackerel was the omnibus amendment in 2011 and also an addendum in 2013. And then on the federal side, Spanish mackerel is managed through the federal coastal migratory pelagics FMP. And any management action to consider addressing the differences between the 2 FMPs was postponed by the board until completion of the 2022 assessment, which, as we just heard, is still undergoing revisions. So next slide, the differences between the 2 FMPs exist in terms of the commercial management zones, the commercial trip limits and closures, allowable gears, the recreational season, and also the recreational accountability measures. So for the commercial management zones, next slide, the interstate FMP defines the northern zone as New York through Georgia, and also note that Rhode Island did join the management unit in 2021. And then for the southern zone, for the interstate FMP, the southern zone is just the east coast of Florida. On the other hand, for the federal FMP, the northern zone is New York through North Carolina, and the southern zone is South Carolina through the east coast of Florida. Next slide. So moving into the commercial trip limits for both the interstate northern zone and the federal northern zone, there is a 3,500 pound commercial trip limit. For the interstate southern zone, which again is just Florida, the trip limit starts at 3,500 pounds and is reduced throughout the season depending on the date and how much of the quota has been harvested. And the lowest step there is a 500 pound trip limit. And under the interstate FMP, states are not required to close state waters when federal waters close. And then for the federal southern zone, which is South Carolina through Florida, the trip limit also starts at 3,500 pounds and then is reduced by how much of the quota has been harvested. And on the federal side, the federal zones close when that federal zone's quota has been met. Next slide. So as John mentioned, just a reminder on some recent federal closures. And as a reminder, the commercial season is March through February for both the federal and interstate FMPs. So in the most recent 4 seasons, including this season, the federal northern zone has closed by the summertime, so in June, July, or August. And in recent years, when this happened, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina have all implemented a reduced trip limit in state waters as well. They implemented a 500-pound trip limit. And then in the federal southern zone, that zone has closed in 2 out of the most recent 4 years, and that closure typically occurs closer to the end of the season in January or February. So moving on to the gear differences, the main difference here is that the interstate FMP lists the prohibited gears for each sector, while the federal FMP lists which gears are allowable. And then for the recreational season, the difference here is that the interstate FMP specifies a calendar year season, while the federal FMP specifies a March through February recreational season. And then finally here for recreational accountability differences on the next slide, under the interstate FMP, if the total ACL is exceeded and the stock is overfished, then the recreational quotas are decreased via reduced bag limits the following year. And under the federal FMP, if the total ACL is exceeded, the bag limits are also reduced. But if the stock is also overfished, then there's a payback reducing the annual catch target. So there's just some slight updates, I think, if the board takes action in the future to align, what the omnibus amendment describes as the quota, just to align the terminology to have it consistent with the federal FMP. So that wraps up my presentation on the differences. Again, I think this is something that will come up again next year as the board meets to consider any sort of Spanish mackerel action, following what the council does in the coming months. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Questions? Go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah, and I'm not sure this question's going to make sense, but we were just talking about we are potentially staring down the barrel of a reallocation, and I'm wondering how this misalignment would impact that conversation, or if it does.
That's a good question. I might turn to John for some help, but I mean, in terms of the allocation between the commercial and recreational sectors, I'm not sure the misalignment would have too much of an impact, more than what we already have in terms of the different northern and southern zones. But I'll see if John has anything you want to add to that.
No, I think that's right. The first discussion the council will have will be the commercial rec allocation. That's the primary bit. And then I don't know if there's been a lot of thought about any shifting within those commercial zones at this time. So it should be pretty informative what gets put on the table in December, I suppose, and see what council members bring up.
And just to remind folks, the current allocation is 55 commercial, 45 recreational.
Yeah, I think, part of this goes back to what Spud was saying on where are these fisheries prosecuted, because if we don't have a requirement in our plan to go to that reduced trip limit, then, one of the questions becomes, do states have the authority to do that on their own? Fortunately, the main states in that northern zone from North Carolina are able to and have been doing that. And so that becomes a question for us as well. Other questions for Emily or thoughts on this? Go ahead then.
Yeah, so is there any particular timeline or urgency to address this misalignment? And I ask that because I think that this really does feed back to the conversation about really digging into the distribution of our landings. Where are these landings happening? Are they in state waters, or are they in fed waters? And it seems like one path forward would be to, rather than trying to align ourselves with the federal plan, to separate ourselves from the federal plan. So I'm just kind of wondering if one thing has to happen before the other, or if they happen together, or if we even want to think about taking back Spanish mackerel.
Okay, I guess, go ahead, Spud.
Well, when this came up at the advisory panel meeting, council staff were quick to say, well, you know, one of the first things we do is we take those 10 criteria that you use to evaluate whether a species should be subject to federal management, and you sort of run them back through that with what is the current situation with the fishery. So I think part of what we'll be doing is sort of taking, okay, what do we know about the way the Spanish mackerel fishery works now along the coast? Run it back through those criteria, look at how, you know, those criteria apply to it, and use that as sort of the first filter of whether, you know, should we even consider moving, you know, from a joint management environment to a interstate commission management environment. And I will certainly look to y'all in North Carolina northward. The other thing I heard pretty clear and loud from the guys that are fishing entanglement gear north of Lookout is, please keep giving us our 500-pound closed season allowance, because they're fishing on species where, it goes back to what John was saying, you've got an abundant and widely distributed stock and they can't avoid them. So if you take away that 500-pound, might as well call it a bycatch allowance, then, you know, you're going to have a lot of bycatch and you're going to have a lot of waste. So they're saying, you know, until we can reconfigure this fishery to something different than what it is, please don't take that away, because that's preventing a lot of waste that would be unavoidable otherwise.
So I think also partly in response to Lynn's question in terms of addressing this alignment maybe sooner rather than later, you know, one of the things that council could potentially address at some point is this issue of the northern zone closure. So if the council does take action on that, it might be beneficial to wait and see, you know, what their action might be. So if the board does want to align or, you know, not align with the council FMP, we at least know what the council's next step might be. I think there's still a lot of question marks as to potential action the council might take next year.
Scott, and then Chris.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, and two, just maybe to allay some fears. I mean, I think our plans, and Mel and John can correct me if I'm wrong, with using this allocation decision tree tool is just sort of try it out. Want to see, okay, here's where we are with our ABCs, our ACLs. You know, we're going to run, again, what's the fishery? We're going to run it through this tool and just say, okay, what would we do different? You know, if we wanted to. That doesn't mean that we're committing ourselves to any course of action by using that decision tree. Is that what we all agree? Is that we've developed this tool? You know, it takes basically the biology, the ecology, the social, the economic, and it's designed to merge all that together to give us something other than just the traditional historic, you know, catch history, you know, kind of approach to it. So, but I don't think anybody is saying, well, we're going to take whatever that tool produces as an output and immediately put it into an amendment or something. I mean, that's certainly not my understanding.
Yeah, the important thing about the tool is, and this was stressed by staff when they were developing it and council was approving the concept, is it doesn't give you the answer that it doesn't give you the answer. It gives you a process for getting to an answer and evaluating alternatives. But, you know, it's not the kind of thing where you're going to plug in data, spit out the results and say, okay, there you go. You know, it's really kind of a way to make sure you go through all the different pieces of data for each stock each time, and you're consistent in looking at it across stocks and how you evaluate things. But yeah, like Spud said, it doesn't give you the answer, and it certainly doesn't obligate you then to go in and change the allocation as well. So yeah, it's hard to say where that will play out, and we've not used it a whole lot. So it's a very new thing. This will be one of the first real applications of it, and see where it takes us.
Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. As stated before, we're really not in a position to address the misalignment between the two plans. We're handling it on an ad hoc basis, more or less, when it comes to dealing with commercial trip limits after the federal ACL closes, for instance. But looking at the list of things that are kind of misaligned, a couple points to think about for this board and the council. You know, when the council moves forward on an amendment, is the 3,500 pound trip limit to start things off isn't constraining too hard to any of the fishery, if barely any of the fishery. And that's been discussed by the council before and received some pushback from the commercial fishery. But when you start at a high trip limit that essentially is unlimited, that results in hitting your ACLs a lot quicker. Rationing out the quota with more reasonable trip limits is probably something worth exploring. And the accountability measures for the recreational fishery, where we look at bag limit reductions to address overages. I think we've noticed with other recreational fisheries that you relying on that tool alone doesn't always get you where you need to go, because in many cases, even with a high bag limit, you have to reduce that bag limit by a big number to get any impact. So having something maybe a little less prescriptive in terms of addressing overages like we do with other recreational fisheries is something that should be considered in the future. But we're not in a position to move forward on anything until all these other things we talked about earlier get resolved. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And I think one thing that we can do, Emily and I, is just keep track of this, and we can provide updates to the board as necessary. And then of course we'll get us back on an agenda when needed. So I think unless there's any other hands on this, we can move into the next agenda item, which is the considering the fishery management plan reviews and state compliance for the 2021 fishing year. I'll be turning this over to Emily, who will do a presentation first on Spanish mackerel, and we'll pause after that, and then we'll move into cobia.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So next slide, I'll start with the Spanish mackerel FMP review. We've already been discussing Spanish mackerel for a bit, so I'll keep it brief. But for the interstate FMP, for the omnibus amendment for both the recreational and commercial sector, there's a 12-inch fork length or 14-inch total length size limit. For the recreational sector, there's a 15 fish creel limit, and fish must be landed with the head and fins intact. And then for the commercial fishery, I already went over the trip limits, so we'll move on to the next slide. As far as the status of the stock, as noted earlier, the 2012 assessment CDR 28 found the stock to be not overfished nor experiencing overfishing. And again, this current stock assessment CDR 78 completed in 2022 with a terminal year of 2020 is still undergoing additional revisions before being considered for use in management. So moving on to the status of the fishery, as a reminder, all the landings in the FMP review are calendar year landings. And also this FMP review uses the current recalibrated MRIP estimates from the Fishing Effort Survey. The previous FMP reviews listed the state-by-state landings from the Coastal Household Telephone Survey. However, with the intent of this new assessment to update to the FES-based landings, the PRT agreed it was timely to switch these FMP reviews to reflect what MRIP currently reports for landings. So the FMP review does include this figure showing the comparison from the previous Coastal Household Telephone Survey harvest estimates, which is the gray dashed line, to the current FES-based estimates, which is the solid black line. Again, you can see those higher estimates with the new FES landings. So next slide. As far as total landings in 2021, combined commercial and recreational, the combined landings were an estimated 14.6 million pounds, with the commercial fishery harvesting approximately 33% of that total, and the rec fishery harvesting about 67% of that total, again, based on the current MRIP estimates. For the commercial sector specifically, in 2021, landings were 4.75 million pounds, of which 72% were landed in Florida and 24% in North Carolina as the majority there. And for the commercial sector, 2021 is one of only 3 years since 1995 with commercial landings over 4 million pounds. On the recreational side, again, according to the current MRIP estimates, recreational anglers harvested 8.6 million Spanish mackerel, or about 9.8 million pounds, which is the highest in the time series. And again, Florida and North Carolina account for the majority there. Florida with 69% and North Carolina with 15% by number of fish. And then the number of recreational releases of Spanish mackerel have generally increased over time, reaching the highest in the time series in 2021 with 6 million releases. Next slide. Again, as we heard earlier, there were some questions about the 2020 and 21 MRIP estimates. So the F&P review will be updated with those revised MRIP estimates that John went over once they've been updated in the MRIP database. So this figure here shows the commercial landings in blue and the recreational landings in gray. Again, you can see 2020 and 21 were the highest recreational landings in the time series, and commercial landings over the past few decades have largely been below 4 million pounds, except for a couple of years, including 2021. And then as far as compliance and 2021 implementation, the PRT found no inconsistencies from the FMP. And again, a note here that Rhode Island just declared interest in Spanish mackerel last year, so they are currently developing regulations through their state process for Spanish mackerel. And then finally, to wrap up here on the next slide, for de minimis, for Spanish mackerel, a state qualifies for de minimis if its previous 3-year average combined commercial and rec landings is less than 1% of the coastwide average. And de minimis states are not required to implement any monitoring programs, although there are no specific monitoring requirements in the FMP. Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Delaware have all requested de minimis, and they all do meet the requirements for de minimis. So I'm happy to take any questions before I start the cobia FMP review, if folks have any questions on Spanish mackerel.
Okay, Shannon and then Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If Lynn's question is about the FMP review, I might let her take it first. No, different. Okay. So as the conversation has been developing around the table before we get off of Spanish mackerel, my question was more a question of process. I think that, you know, a lot of us are asking questions about looking to characterize the fishery, gathering information about how the northern states are prosecuting their fisheries and things like that. And you floated the idea of forming a technical committee to start to potentially tackle some of these questions. And maybe we don't have specific tasks for that TC just yet. But it does sound like we're going to need to start to gather a lot of this information in order to be able to really drill down on some of the questions that are coming out of this board. So my question is, what do we need to do to form a TC, and do we potentially want to discuss that happening today, or going back to the states and starting to evaluate what our workloads look like, who could potentially sit on that, et cetera? I just don't know what the process looks like.
Yeah, it's a great question, and we'll turn it over to Bob. And I do think that, you know, now that we've split this group out, I don't think we have any other TC that would seem appropriate to kind of lean on. So we'll go to Bob.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the process is actually very simple. If this board wants a technical committee for Spanish mackerel, they can make that decision, and then we would reach out to the states to populate the committee. And it's so pretty straightforward if that's what the board wants to do. It doesn't have to go to the policy board or anything else. It's a board decision at this level.
And then maybe over the next few months, once we identify a potential TC member or point of contact for each state, as staff, I can work with each contact to maybe for each state to submit some general information on how their fisheries are prosecuted. We can come up with a couple questions for each state to fill out. So we have sort of, I think someone mentioned sort of like a fishery profile for the commission states to get an idea of how the fisheries are prosecuted in each state. So I'm seeing some head nods, so I can work on that over the next few months.
Okay, thanks. Lynn?
My question is resolved. Thank you.
Go ahead, Marty.
Thanks, Joe. More maybe a question for Jason or Eric. I'm always intrigued by this northernmost distribution of fish when they're shifting or expanding. And I was wondering if either of you could characterize what you're seeing up there in space and time in terms of that species moving into your waters.
Well, thank you for the question. And I just wanted to thank this board for putting Rhode Island on this board. I was really, enthralled by a conversation about models that don't work and reallocation and all this other stuff. So it's none of your business what happens in Rhode Island because we're going to be out of here in about 5 minutes. To answer your question, Marty, I know outside of Narragansett Bay, I think it's still in state waters. There have been floating fish traps there forever, and they catch those fish pretty regular in the summertime. They're a lot of work to get in the water and get out of the water, and you can't find good help now. So I don't know how many of those traps are physically in the water now, but I think the majority of our landings in the past is from that particular gear. But I'm sure the rec sector catches them rod and reel, and there is some, gill netting for bluefish and other things like that, which would certainly catch that fish as well. So we don't land a lot of them, but I mean, where's Tom Foti? I've been around a long time, and back in 1979, it was nothing to have 3,000, 4,000 pounds of Spanish mackerel and fish trap in a day.
Eric, you asked. Tom has his hand up, so go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I've seen over the years particular times that we had Spanish mackerel all over the jetties, and just when the warm water came up, we got them, and we're probably going to be getting a lot more with the change of temperatures. I mean, it's something looking forward to. So that may maybe replace some of the fish that we're moving north out of our area. But yeah, it's interesting.
Okay, I do want to continue to move us along, but I guess Bob mentioned it's simple, but I'm not sure. Did he mean do we need a formal motion or just we assume that it's the will of the board?
I don't think we need a motion to form a TC where it's the will of the board. We'll all move forward with that as staff.
Okay, so we'll reach out. We'll send an email looking for nominees for that. Okay, and we'll move on to cobia, and I'm sure we'll have some questions there. So go ahead, Emily.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So you can move on. Perfect. So I'll get in now to shifting gears to this board's other species, which is the Atlantic stock of cobia. So I'll go over the FMP review here. So as a reminder, next slide, Atlantic cobia are currently managed through Amendment 1 to the Interstate FMP approved in 2019, which transitioned Atlantic cobia to sole management by the Commission. And then also Addendum 1 was approved in 2020. So the total harvest quota for fishing years 21 through 23 is about 80,000 fish, which is allocated 96% to the recreational sector and 4% to the commercial sector. So for the commercial sector, along with size limits and possession limits, commercial harvest from non-de minimis states, which currently is Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, is tracked and reported to the Commission throughout the season, and the fishery closes if commercial landings reach the specified commercial closure trigger. And then 4% of the commercial quota portion is set aside for de minimis harvest. So for the recreational fishery, again, in addition to size and possession limits, the recreational quota is allocated to state harvest targets for non-de minimis states. And so every couple of years when specifications are set, these states evaluate their average landings against their harvest quota and have to adjust measures if they're exceeding that target. And 1% of the recreational quota is set aside for de minimis harvest, and states that have recreational de minimis status can either adopt the same measures as the nearest non-de minimis state, or they can simply adopt a 37-inch total length minimum size limit and a 1 fish per vessel limit. As far as the status of the stock for Atlantic cobia, the most recent assessment was CDR 58, completed in 2020 with a terminal year of 2017. It found the stock was not overfished and overfishing was not occurring. The next CDR assessment is tentatively scheduled for 2025 with a terminal year of either 2023 or 2024. And as a reminder, the Atlantic cobia stock extends from Georgia northward. Cobia in Florida waters are considered part of the Gulf of Mexico stock, which is not managed by the Commission. So for landings in 2021, total Atlantic cobia landings, both the commercial and recreational sectors combined, were about 2.7 million pounds, with only 2.5% from the commercial sector and over 97% from the recreational sector. And total 2021 landings were about a 13% increase from 2020. And then on the commercial side, 2021 landings, you can go back a slide, please, thank you, were 66,499 pounds, with Virginia and North Carolina harvesting the majority with about 44% each. And then the total landings from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, so those non-de minimis states, did not reach the closure trigger, so the fishery was open through the end of the year. And then for the recreational sector in 2021, rec landings were about 2.6 million pounds, or just under 91,000 fish. By number, Virginia landed the majority with 63%, and North Carolina landed 12%. Looking at the whole time series from 1981 through 2021, average recreational harvest is about 1 million pounds per year, but as you can see, more recently, landings have increased, so this most recent 10-year average is about 2.1 million pounds per year. And then as far as recreational releases, those have also generally increased. Over the last 5 years, an average of 79% of the recreational catch were released alive, and this is higher than the previous 5-year average of about 61%. So this figure just shows the commercial and recreational landings in pounds. Again, you can see the commercial sector is pretty small there at the bottom in orange. And then the rest is the recreational landings with some increases in recent years, as well as some fluctuations year to year. And then as far as 2021 implementation, the PRT found no inconsistencies from the FMP. We did see a few regulation changes in 2021 based on Addendum 1. So after evaluating their previous landings against their new harvest target, Virginia implemented measures designed to reduce their recreational harvest by 42% by lowering their vessel limit and shortening their season. And then North Carolina was able to liberalize their measures, and they increased the vessel limit for private anglers only for an additional month during the year. And then for de minimis states changed their measures again to either adopt the nearest non-de minimis state, which for all de minimis states is Virginia, or adopted the standard de minimis measure from the FMP. So there's a couple of points here from the PRT regarding de minimis. So on the recreational side, to qualify for de minimis, a state's recreational harvest in 2 of the past 3 years must be less than 1% of coastwide landings during that time. So Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Florida all requested de minimis status, and all of these states met the requirement except for Maryland. And in their compliance report, Maryland noted that given the variability in landings from year to year, after having 0 harvest in 2019 and being just over that 1% threshold in 2020, Maryland requested to continue under de minimis until this year's harvest can be evaluated. And the PRT did discuss and agree with this rationale. And for commercial de minimis, we had a similar situation. So to qualify for commercial de minimis landings for 2 of the last 3 years must be less than 2% of the annual landings during that time. And so we had Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Georgia, and Florida request commercial de minimis status. and all met the qualifications except for New Jersey. And in their compliance report, New Jersey noted that their 2019 and 2021 landings were considered to be pretty anomalously high. And also they're tracking their current landings this year, and their current landings are less than 20% of what the landings were during those high years. So New Jersey requested to continue under de minimis until this year's harvest can be evaluated. And again, the PRT did agree with this rationale. So the PRT recommends the board approve all de minimis requests, including Maryland and New Jersey. This sort of brought up a conversation at the PRT level that over the next few years, you could see multiple states starting to exceed this de minimis threshold, especially if cobia landings in the mid-Atlantic continue to increase. And there's some potential management implications here, including, if a state becomes non-de minimis for commercial, they would have to start conducting in-season monitoring and reporting of their commercial harvest. And then on the recreational side, if a state becomes non-de minimis, you have to add that state to the calculation of recreational harvest targets. And then another thing is the current allocation regarding those recreational harvest targets is based only on data through 2015. So that's another thing the PRT noted the board may need to update sort of in the coming years. So, from the PRT's perspective, they recommend that as the board is discussing new cobia specifications next year and with the upcoming stock assessment, the board should also discuss whether these updates to the recreational harvest targets and the allocations would be appropriate at that time as well. And then just to wrap up, the final note from the PRT here is the PRT noted that New York's recent commercial cobia landings were 6.9% of coastwide landings in 2020 and 2.4% in 21. And so based on those years, the PRT recommends New York declare an interest in Atlantic cobia and update their regulations to meet de minimis. I believe that New York has actually already started the process of updating their regulations to the de minimis requirements. And the PRT also noted that, depending on future landings, that, as we mentioned before, this in-season monitoring, may need to be required in some states. So that's all I have for the FMP review for cobia, a little bit more than Spanish mackerel. So if folks have questions, I'm happy to address those.
I'm gonna look for hands on questions, and as we eat lunch today, we're gonna have to think some big thoughts on what de minimis means for this species, because it's kind of baked in since we have rec harvest targets by state, and as states move out of de minimis status there, and I'll tell you, Jim, if MRIP doesn't show decent numbers for New York and New Jersey this year, then I'm worried that survey is missing what's really happening on the water, because there was an awful lot of talk about that. And after we get through questions, we'll look for motions for approval for both species. But any questions? Go ahead, Malcolm.
And this is probably just housekeeping, but Florida, since they're a member of this board and requested recreational de minimis, is that just kind of housekeeping?
Yes, exactly. So Florida is so required to submit a compliance report every year that basically says they harvested 0 cobia from the Atlantic migratory stock.
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Thanks, Chairman. And just to give an update on New York, we're struggling with the data. In fact, it's like, are we going to get into declaring the fishery, then declare out of the fishery and declare back into the fishery the way the data is going? So just an update of what New York's doing. We do have a rulemaking and process to adopt the current de minimis commercial and recreational harvest regulations, and we've initiated another rulemaking so that if we exceed the coastwide TAC, whatever that, we'll be able to shut the fishery down. So we've got the regulatory mechanisms in process. But yeah, 2021, the landings were over 2%, whatever, the 6 point whatever percent. And then this year, up to right now, we've landed 200 pounds. So and same thing on the recreational side. We had the last 10 years, no landings from MRIP. This year, we've got 3,500 fish we landed. So, it's really all over the place. So at this point, we're not going to plan to declare in until we get some more stable data, because there's a lot of other factors going on, and I'm sure coming out of the COVID and everything is really making things kind of crazy. But but we're going to keep monitoring it, and once we get to that point, we'll clearly do what we need to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. And so if no other hands on questions here, we'll look for a motion to get these FMP reviews approved. Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to make that motion. I move to approve the Atlantic, there we go. Whoops. I move to approve the Spanish mackerel FMP review for the 2021 fishing year, state compliance reports, and de minimis requests for Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Delaware.
Thank you for that. Motion by Lynn Fagley. Second, Doug Hammond. Okay, we have that up. Any discussion on the motion? Go ahead, Malcolm.
And just kind of housekeeping, do we need to add also approving the recommendations for the PRT looking into those de minimis issues? Is that part of this, or does that need to be added on to the motion?
I think that's for cobia, and we don't need to add it to the motion. I think that's something that the technical committee and the PRT can discuss next year when looking into cobia specifications. But thanks for that.
Okay, thank you. Any objection to the motion? No hands? Great. Okay, we'll consider that approved and by unanimous consent, and we'll look for a motion for the cobia review. Let's read it. Thanks, Doug. Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I move to approve the Atlantic cobia FMP review for 2021 fishing year, state compliance reports, de minimis requests for Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Georgia, and Florida.
Great, thanks. Second by Mel Bell. Any discussion? Great. Any objection to the motion? Seeing no objections, also approved by unanimous consent. If there's any other business to come before the board, you're not going to be very popular, but go ahead. No, great. So I'll look for a motion to adjourn, but before I do, I want to say thank you again to Emily and John for a great job. Motion by Malcolm. All right, we are adjourned.